Welcome back, everybody, and congratulations. This is our last lecture, and we're going to be talking about spiritual health today. So let's jump right in. A lot of times when people think about spiritual health, they think about, am I a good or a bad person? And when we're thinking about this question, most people think they are good people. And even people who have done terrible things, there's lots of studies that show that people tend to think they're a good person even if they've done bad things. And that's not entirely incorrect, because I came across this quote, which I think kind of highlights the point I'm trying to make here, and it goes, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." And this was from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And to really fully understand this, you need to know who Alexander Solzhenitsyn was. He was sent to one of the gulags under Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union. Basically, they would work you to death there if you did not agree with the regime. A very brutal existence, right? I don't even think you can begin to imagine. Here is kind of a picture of the Gulag Archipelago. There were over 2,000 of these concentration camps under Stalin, and they went quite a while, I believe into the 1960s. I could be wrong on that, but maybe even later. It was not a good place to be. And when Alexander Solzhenitsyn was in there, he started thinking about life and the struggles and everything. And he started to realize that every human was deciding whether they were going to be good or evil based on their circumstance. And so, you always have to be aware that you are going to be wrestling with that choice of what you're going to do. He ended up writing this book right here called The Gulag Archipelago. I highly recommend it. It is a very dark book. It is hard to read, but it is. I think it's good to put just your life into perspective and to show how difficult some people's lives are. Anyways, so back to this idea that humans have the propensity to be good or evil, and they can be both all at the same time, or throughout their life, I guess. And some movies really highlight this, particularly Lord of the Rings and Star Wars come to mind. The dark side, and what this kind of highlights is that humans have a propensity for great evil, and so in your life you are always going to be battling this. And if your life is easier, you might not be battling this as much. But when life gets hard, this is when the dark side tends to tempt people, right? Especially when people get suicidal. They can go into really dark places. And so these movies kind of highlight this. This quote highlights this. And you need to be aware that you have a dark side. A lot of people are naive and they think, oh, well, no, I'm a good person. I couldn't ever do anything evil, right? And that's just incorrect. You haven't been put in a situation where you're tempted like that. So what we want to do is we want to develop ourselves so we can resist that and we don't go to the dark side, right? So actually I'm going to show you this right here. I've been looking at different religions and trying to figure out what they all have in common, because spiritual health kind of goes along with religion. And I found this riddle, I guess you would call it. And the riddle goes, if God is omniscient, which means if he is all-knowing, if God is omnipotent, which means he is all-powerful, and then omnipresent, which means he is everywhere at all times, what is he lacking? And it's quite a hard riddle. Obviously, you see the answer is limitation. So if you have a God that is all-knowing, all-powerful, and everywhere at all times, then he is limited. That's what he is lacking. And then in some religious texts, they have said, well, that is where humans are, because humans are limited, right? And that's where humans come in. So with that in mind, the next question would be, what does limitation cause, or what does limitation bring? And what it brings is suffering, because life is difficult. Oh, let me bring this down. Because life is difficult. Life is hard. At some point in your life, probably everybody that you know is going to die. People are going to get terrible diseases. You're going to get your heart broken. All kinds of terrible things are going to happen in life. And so life is difficult. And so I actually looked through a bunch of different religions, and that is a common theme. Mostly is suffering. And I found this quote from Friedrich Nietzsche as well, which tends to agree with all these. And the quote goes, "To live is to suffer." And let's just stop right there real quick. To live is to suffer. So that's not a very good, not a very motivating statement. We'll say that. But the good news behind that, and it does tend to be true, is that a lot of people think that they are the only ones out there suffering. They're struggling away and they think there's something wrong with them. But that's not the case. Everybody's struggling, everybody's suffering on some level or at some point in their life, right? So you are definitely not the only one. Nothing is wrong with you. So that is the good news in that first line right there. Okay, let's continue. So to live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. And so what he's basically saying there is you need to have some type of purpose to your life. Religions can provide that with a higher purpose. If you're not religious, then we need to think, and I mean, even if you are, we need to think, how can you get meaning out of your life? And it turns out the way you get meaning in your life is to adopt responsibility. So this is the first, I guess, point that I want to make when you're trying to develop your character and develop who you are, is you need to accept responsibility for your life and for how it's going to go. Now, life is not fair, life is hard, life can be brutal, but that doesn't mean you can't accept responsibility for that. And that's kind of what Alexander Solzhenitsyn was wrestling with when he was sent to those internment camps. And so when we think about this, if you think about people you admire, the reason you admire them is because they are able to handle a great amount of responsibility. And what you want to strive to do is become one of those admirable people. So start thinking about what you can become responsible for, and start small. Maybe it's just keeping your room clean. That would be a great place to start. Then you can start taking responsibility for your health. Make sure you're exercising, eating healthy, getting to bed on time, right? Cultivating a good social network, learning how to survive financially, right? These are responsibilities that you slowly want to start piecing together throughout your life. And that's how you're going to become an responsible adult. That's how you're going to succeed in the world. And it's not easy, right? It is difficult. But the good news is you get to choose your responsibility. So start piecing that together. Okay. Let's move on to some other rules here. Rule number 2 is to discipline yourself. And so disciplining yourself is kind of training yourself to handle difficult times and to do difficult things. And right now you're young and you are learning faster than ever. This is your chance to really develop as a human. And so you want to learn how to discipline yourself. Athletes kind of have this built in, but I do see a lot of athletes without the discipline, especially with their sleep schedules, right? And it's like, if you want to be a great athlete, you have to learn to discipline yourself. And it's not fun, right? But disciplining yourself has lots of benefits. 1, it allows you to do difficult things. And 2, it helps you to handle that dark side of yourself, right? So when people think, am I a good person? A lot of times they think, oh, well, I would never hurt anybody, so I am a good person. But that doesn't mean you're harmless does not equal good. What equals good is, because again, humans are capable of great evil, is that you are able to recognize that and you are able to not partake in that. And you are able to, choose the light side over the dark side. So, and discipline is how you get there, right? So training yourself to exercise however often, 5 days a week, training yourself to eat enough food or to not overeat, or training yourself to get to sleep on time, or whatever it is, right? And one of the reasons why you want to discipline yourself is you want to see who you can become, because right now you're young and you have all this potential and you can almost become anything. I mean, you have limitation, you have genetic limits and so on, and circumstantial limits, but the older you get, your potential is going to decrease, and that should really light a fire under you, because you want to see who you can become in this life. Okay, and part of that is learning to tell the truth. So I don't think we focus on this enough, to be honest. I think sometimes people just brush off telling the truth. They don't take it seriously, but this is probably, you really need to try to tell the truth as often as possible. So there's a few reasons, and we'll go through those. 1 is that lying messes with your reality. So if you are lying to others to manipulate the situation, what you're actually doing is you are teaching your brain that reality doesn't matter. And that is not a good way to be going, right? It's going to end up hurting you in the long run. So you really need to be telling yourself the truth, because when you tell others the truth, you're telling yourself the truth. And people lie to themselves all the time. So you got to be honest with yourself. You got to be honest with others. Part of that too is if you are lying to other people, they're eventually going to catch on and they're going to lose trust in you. And your word is one of the most important things you have. Some people call it the logos, right? And some people say that the logos is the highest thing. And this is, there's lots of definitions for the logos, the spoken word or whatever you want to call it. But if you are a person who tells the truth and you keep your word, you are going to get way farther in life with your friends, with work, with whatever it is, because people know that they can trust you when you say something, and they know that you're going to be a reliable person. And that's going to be one of the most beneficial things in your life. So really try your best to tell the truth as often as possible. Now, there are situations where you don't want to tell the truth, like let's say your girlfriend or boyfriend really loves, I don't know, their new jacket or their jacket, right? And you absolutely hate their jacket. You think their jacket is the most ugliest thing in the world. You don't necessarily need to always tell them everything like that, right? But for the most part, you need to try to tell the truth. And then the other part of this is if you do tell the truth, a lot of times when people are lying, they're trying to manipulate the situation for their benefit. Oftentimes they've messed up and they're just trying to not face the punishment. But if you learn to tell the truth, your life is going to be much more adventurous because you're not going to know the outcome. When you're lying, you're often predicting the outcome so that you can get that outcome with your lie. But if you're always telling the truth, your life is going to be a grand adventure. So that should be reason in itself right there. And then the last rule that I have for you guys, oh, and actually I'm going to lead up to that. So when we talk about telling the truth, there's a famous movie, Pinocchio, right? And he's trying to lie his way through things, and he ends up getting all tangled up, right? He becomes a puppet, and you do not want to be a puppet. That kind of highlights the importance of the individual as well, right? You don't want other people controlling you. You need to speak your mind, say what you think, because that's how society functions. When everybody says what they think, and they say it openly, that's why the freedom of speech is so important. Society tends to function better because we all think differently, and we all have different ideas. We have bad ideas, we have good ideas, and when we all throw those in together, we tend to be able to find some better ideas and tend to orient our society in a better way. So Pinocchio, he is a puppet. He's trying to not be a puppet, and he has this little friend, Jiminy Cricket, who sits on his shoulder, whispers in his ear, and Jiminy Cricket is kind of his conscience, right? Everybody has this little voice in their head that tells them when they're doing something bad. It typically doesn't tell you what to do, but it typically tells you what not to do. And one of the most famous people, and one of the reasons why he was famous, was Socrates. And actually, before I show you this, my final rule is follow your conscience. So one of the things that made Socrates such a great human and really solidified his place in history was that he followed his conscience no matter what. He followed it all the way even until his deathbed right here. So this is a painting of Socrates who was condemned to death, and he is drinking the hemlock, which was poison, and his friends are obviously distressed around him. So the story goes that Socrates, he was charged with corrupting the youth, and this is kind of what the government did back then. And basically the way it worked is you would go to trial and you would be immediately convicted and sentenced to death. And so the reason why they charged him with this is because they wanted him to flee and just leave the country and leave them alone so they could, continue to hold their power. And so Socrates' friends and family, they were convincing him, you need to leave because they're going to kill you. So Socrates is about to leave. And then, Gemini Cricket shows up on his shoulder and he says, don't leave, right? Face this. And that's kind of interesting. And so Socrates, because he made a pact in his life that he was always going to follow his conscience. And so he decided, okay, I'm not going to stop now just because my life is on the line. So he went to trial. They condemned him to death. And then he went willingly and drank the hemlock and really solidified his place in history. And he ended up making more of an impact than if he would have just fled, right? And so if Socrates can follow his conscience all the way to his deathbed, you need to try to learn to follow your conscience. And again, it's going to tell you what not to do. So when you're doing something and you have this little voice say, hey, you probably shouldn't do that, you really need to pay attention to that and try and listen. So, okay, that will do it. Let me just recap this real quick here. So some rules to follow in life is, remember, life is hard. So adopt some responsibility. That's where all the meaning in your life is going to come from. Learn to discipline yourself, learn to tell the truth, and then follow your conscience. It's been a great semester. Thank you for taking my class. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Send me an email. If you have any future videos you want, send me an email, and I will try to make those. And yeah, thank you for taking this class. That's all I have. Take care.